Hello, everyone. I'm Dominik, and I'm going to tell you a few things about making sequels, making indie sequels to be specific. And I'll use an example that I had a chance to work on, which is 60 Parsecs, as the title suggests, which was our studio's second title. But before we jump into that, imagine you find yourself in this very nice, very good situation where you've developed your first or your nth game, and it was kind of successful. Successful enough that you're actually pondering to follow up on it. And you're like, all right, I've got this cool IP, this cool game, people love it, so why wouldn't we make more of it? Why wouldn't we make a second part that's better? Maybe we make a sequel. Maybe the sequel is a prequel. Maybe the sequel is nth part of the series that you're already planning in your mind. Maybe it's already grown into a franchise in your wild imaginations. Or maybe you just want to earn more money, because that's also a common motivation. So if I was to sum up all of my talk and like everything in just one slide and finish this presentation right here, right now, this would be it. Any Lonely Island fans out there? Hands up. Noise. Making sequels seems to be like a dream come true. You get a game, and then you follow up on the game. So kind of seems easier, right? I mean, you've already done this once, so why not do it again? And why would it be harder than the first time? It should be easier. But is it really? Well, I've had my share of dev experience, both working AAA and working on indie titles in our own studio, Robot Gentleman. But the funny thing is, when I was researching the topic before deciding which thing I'm going to talk about at QUO VADIS, I realized that most of the games I worked on in my career were actually sequels. It's really funny if you realize how many of these are floating about. Obviously, it's a bit different for AAA and indie games, but still, we're surrounded by sequels and also recently a lot of remasters and kind of coming back to the same topic over and over again. So it's quite an interesting theme that is worth exploring, not only if you're actually at the stage where you are dealing with making a sequel, but also if you are pondering a future scenario where you might be working on a sequel. For us, before we released 60 Parsecs, we started out with this little game called 60 Seconds. Who's heard of 60 Seconds? Hands up. Pretty impressive. Did you like it? Yes. Good answer. So for those who haven't had the chance to play 60 Seconds, the premise of the game came from a very simple question, which was, what would you do if you had 60 seconds before the world ended? And this developed into this fantasy of a nuclear family, 1950s America, which has to run to their shelter in 60 seconds, collecting supplies, and survive in that shelter during the post-apocalypse for as long as they can, until someone rescues them. So the pitch was pretty straightforward. It was very appealing to audiences, especially in America, but not just America, really, because people had this notion of a family surviving in post-apocalypse, or people surviving post-apocalypse, partly because of the pop culture, the gamers, because of the Fallout series and a number of other games, but also because this was kind of a part of the reality for a lot of people in the 1950s, 1960s, the Cold War era, all the instructional videos on how to survive a nuclear blast by ducking and covering under a desk. That definitely would have worked. Yep. And at the time, when we started working on 60 Seconds, that was 2014, we were a very small team. We're just 2 people, pretty much a garage indie studio. By the time we released the game, it was 3 of us. It was Juliusz, the artist, Berenika, a writer, and myself as the programmer, designer, and writer. And we were able to get the game out, and our kind of modest hope was that it would sell 10,000 copies within a year. That would allow us to keep going and survive to make another game. So we were very surprised to find out that the very first month, the game sold 30,000 copies. And fast forward, today, we're at around the 2 million copy mark on all the platforms that 60 Seconds has released on. And the weird thing is that it keeps on selling and selling and selling. So it's kind of an evergreen, kind of long tail game, which is definitely not what we envisioned, which is a great problem to have. It's a great situation to find yourself in. But obviously, at a certain point, what happens is you kind of grow tired of it, because you kind of keep on working on it. You see it's popular, people like it, and you're actually enjoying it for a while. But then it turns out you've been working on it for 4 years. And you kind of want to do something else, especially if you're indie and you're really, really into creating something new. And all of us are very much into crafting new worlds, crafting new stories, and making them happen and showing them to people, giving them out to people. So at a certain point, around 2016, when we were like past 2 or 3 DLCs, we were releasing the game on mobile, and we're all pushing this ourselves because we're self-published. We don't have any publishers, any third-party distributors, save for the obvious ones, like Steam and other platform holders. We kind of decided that we want to do something else. So we want to kind of leave 60 Seconds be, still maintain it, but at the same time, we wanted to develop something completely different. So we came up with a different concept called Stray, which was supposed to be a narrative, very linear game, very cinematic, a cinematic platformer, in fact, about a lost dog. And we started working on that. So we were running pre-production for a while developing 60 Seconds Forward. But it wasn't quite working. It was taking a long time. We're kind of demotivated, actually, I would say, by 60 Seconds. But at the same time, we were not very keen to come back to the concept of 60 Seconds and developing anything in the 60 franchise, if you will. We didn't want to develop more big DLCs. We didn't want to develop a second game in the series, because it was the 60 Seconds thing was like still like a fresh wound, you could say. Like, it was just like, if we were to do something more at this point, it was just like putting salt in that wound. It was like, no. But at a certain point, because of the maintenance we had to keep running on 60 Seconds, we started growing. So from 3 people, we jumped to 5. Then we grew to 8 and 9. And then, in the end, this is a picture from 2017, we became 13. And that's what we are today. So this really small team, that was 3 people, suddenly grew in size like 4 times over. And all these people were doing various things. And obviously, we saw the potential of having more firepower, if you will. And we thought, wow, we could make incredible things with it. But in order to make the team work properly, we thought, we're not proven yet as a team, so it would be great to work on familiar ground. So why don't we come back to these dusty old concepts that we had for 60 Seconds developed into the future? And maybe consider actually making a sequel. So we were battling with this for a while, but the truth was, yeah, we had like notes and ideas for any future expansions to 60 Seconds that would potentially turn into a separate game. And we had a lot of story ideas, and since we consider ourselves a storytelling studio primarily, we were very keen to actually explore different ways of directing the narrative and sharing it with the gamers, while reusing the framework that we developed and formula that we developed for 60 Seconds with the whole decision consequences cycle, a very vicious cycle where every decision you make has some sort of negative consequences that come biting you in the ass, and then you have to react to that accordingly in the later game. One of the ideas that we had, that we were huge fans of, was setting 60 parsecs, which was not called 60 parsecs then, it was called 60 Seconds 2000. And then it was called 62 seconds, then it was called something else, I don't remember, but we had quite a time trying to decide what to call it. But we came with this concise idea for coming back to the 1950s, but instead of focusing on a nuclear family in an American suburbia, moving the thing into the orbit and pushing the story into more of a Cold War paranoia / space race kind of deal. So 60 parsecs is set in the same universe, in the same setup as 60 Seconds. The nuclear war starts. America blows to bits, and likely the rest of the world as well. But instead of being a family, you find yourself as one of these astro-citizen cadets. And suddenly you become the captain of a vessel that has to escape from a station 60 seconds before it gets blown by nuclear weapons. And in the end, instead of fleeing with your family, you flee with your choice of other space, astro-citizen cadets, so other potential space explorers, and you can shape your crew the way you want. The formula stayed the same, but we decided, in a typical sequel route, we want to make it bigger, we want to make it better, we want to explore certain things that we didn't have a chance to explore in 60 seconds, either because we ran ourselves into a dead technical end, or because we didn't have the potential to do it, because of it was only 2 of us, or maybe because we had more ideas seeing how people played and wanted to work on specific aspects of the narrative that we hadn't had a chance to explore in 60 seconds. Especially, I was personally interested in kind of focusing more on individual characters and developing a more sophisticated story branching system, which would allow for more reactive events and kind of more a game that would react more to your choices. So you'd actually see is like you do a choice, and obviously there's consequences, but there's actually far long-lasting consequences. You see it in almost every bit of the game that you come to later on. So we changed a bunch of bits. We decided, the scavenge bit of 60 seconds, if you remember it, it was in 3D, which didn't really sit well with the 2D second part in the bunker. So for Parsecs, we decided to go all 2D. So we had this scavenge remade into, it was very familiar to what happened in 60 seconds, but at the same time, it was more 2.5D instead of 3D. But if you compare the screenshots from the survival part of 60 seconds and 60 parsecs, you can see that there's a lot of similarity. There's still 4 people seated in a very constrained space, very claustrophobic space, and they go nuts at some points. A lot, like always, yeah. So someone called 60 Seconds a family degeneration simulator, and I think that's a fair description of what the game was, and this definitely translated into Parsecs. So like I said, we kind of started out with assumptions about the sequel, and we thought it's going to be easier for us to develop. It's going to be easier for the new team to develop and learn from us. Like what we achieved with 60 seconds, we could kind of convey to our new colleagues, and they would be able to work with us. They would be able to catch up on how we reached our inspiration, how we reached the ideas that we reached, and then move on and try to make something better, bigger together. So we had a plan to develop the sequel in 12 months. We kind of figured, it's like we're going to have a prolonged pre-production because we want to figure this out well, and then we're going to push in and get it done in 12 months. No. We did it in 20 months. We started February 2017. We released the game September 2018. And the game was supposed originally to release at the beginning of 2018. We never announced it, so that was good. So it was like, we announced the game in September 2017. And we knew at that time that we wouldn't be able to release in February or January. But still, we thought we would be able to make it before kind of the first quarter, or like the second quarter of 2018 closed. That didn't happen. We initially had a team of 3 people added to our team, so like a sub-team. So originally we were Juliusz, Berenika, and myself. We could have been considered like a designer, a programmer, and an artist. So we wanted to replicate that with the new team. So the first 3 people that joined us for the creative team were exactly that: designer, coder, and an artist. But in the process, it turned out that wasn't enough for what we envisioned. We had extra people come in for Stray, and we had to pull them all off Stray at a certain point and push them into Parsecs. And then we ended up hiring more people, and soon enough, the entire studio was working on Parsecs. Like, no one was working on any other project. There was someone running interference on 60 seconds, and that was necessary, and oftentimes it was me. But at the same time, we also had external contractors. We had another studio coding for us. We had a contingent of writers, 5 writers, external writers, working on Parsecs. And we had a bunch of other people, like QA, designers. We also had like interns at the time who helped us a lot. And if you actually count people involved, it was around 30 people working on this fairly small indie game, which is insane. And, you know, that sounds weird if you think about the fact that we actually reused the formula, right? We're coming back to this concept of 60 seconds, which was proven, and it worked, and we had it, like, in tech, in writing, you could say. It all worked. What happened? We remade most of the tech. We remade most of the stuff. And we discovered that if we remake a lot of the things, even though it worked in the original, you still have to fine-tune it for the new one, even if you're doing exactly the same thing. And the problem was we didn't do exactly the same thing. There was a lot of similarities on the outside, but if you actually kind of dived into it, it was a lot different on the kind of underneath. It's kind of tip of the iceberg. It was like, yeah, that's a very, like, they made a mod for 60 seconds. That's 60 parsecs. But underneath, totally different. And obviously, we had the ambition to make 60 parsecs bigger in some respects to 60 seconds. Especially, we wanted to increase the number of events, the number of story elements, so that there would be less repetition when it came to kind of replaying the game. Because 60 seconds was all about replayability. But there was only like a couple of times before you started seeing that certain events get repeated over and over again. And you know that was to be expected because of the finite amount of events that we had, which was after all the DLCs, I think somewhere in the zone of 200 to 300. So we thought we'll do something more for parsecs, and we kind of overshot it. The text alone, quoting 500 text pages versus 150 text pages, that was insane. There is very few text games that actually do localization, just because the number of text, the amount of text you get, suddenly becomes too expensive to translate. And we were actually fighting till the very end to make this a localized game, and we were able to do that, but it was a close call. It's like one of my favorite games, like Sunless Sea. You wouldn't like it has much more text than we do. You wouldn't see it in any other language than English because they wrote it, and you know, translating thousands and thousands of words and pages is super expensive. Like if you actually calculate, oftentimes it's more expensive to pay the translators than it is to pay your writers, which is pretty insane. But that's what happened. So 3 to 4 times bigger game. And you'd think that 3 to 4 times bigger team would handle it, but were we actually able to? We delivered the game, we shipped it, that's true, but it was not without casualties. And if you actually take a look at more detailed data, I took the liberty of taking the first 6 months of Parsec sales and user score, which roughly amounts to this. I'm obviously not giving the exact numbers because Steam would shoot me. But, and yeah, just to be clear, these are Steam numbers only. I mean, I'm not including other platforms because Parsecs, for normalization, Parsecs is only released on Steam. 18th March was the 6-month mark since it was released, and it sold around 50,000 copies to date with an 81% user score. It only had one 50% sale, so it wasn't like given out like crazy. And if you look at the dynamics of how it was popular, you can see, oh, this. So there was like a big boom at the beginning for the release, and there was a few other bumps when there was like announcements or like the winter sale, the Chinese New Year sale, but overall it flatlined fairly quick. If you compare it to 60 seconds, which also the first 6 months of 60 seconds back in 2015, you can see that it sold almost twice the amount of copies. It had a very similar dynamics in terms of sales, only one 50% sale in the first 6 months, and that was at the end of it. It had a slightly less, smaller user score. It also had a slightly smaller price because 60 seconds is priced at $10 and in dollars, and Parsecs is priced at $15. But despite the fact that 60 seconds was completely not marketed, and we spent quite a budget on marketing Parsecs in comparison, the dynamics was a bit different. Like, you had a big jump in the beginning, and it kind of maintained a very steady cycle of ups and downs, ups and downs. And the funny part is, this is the same cycle we're seeing over and over until this day. There's like a snowball effect in place where the game just keeps on being popular, just probably because it's popular, but also because there's a lot of traffic on it due to YouTube and whatnot. Which sadly has not happened in the same way for Parsecs. So Parsecs has been slower in comparison. Why is that? It's a good question. There's a number of factors that might have been in play, but I won't discuss that today. What I can tell you, definitely, and I'm sure you all kind of reached the same conclusion seeing what mistakes we've made in the process, is there's a number of traps where you're developing sequels, especially that they lure you into this state of being very comfortable because you feel like you know the subject and you can pursue it with more efficiency than the original. So you always want to make something bigger, but then you end up with what we had, which is like 3 to 4 times bigger game. And despite the fact that we have 3 or 4 times more people, that does not necessarily translate into our ability to make 3 or 4 times more content at the same time. If you're programmers, you might be familiar with, forgive me if I mistake the name, but I think it was Brooks who said that, who actually developed the theory that if you introduce more programmers into the project, that does not scale your ability to do more work. So 2 programmers will not do 200% of the work. It's more likely that they will do like 150% or something. So there's always an overhead in terms of communication, people getting people in sync, and just cooperating in a bigger team. And this is not scalable. Sure, you do something more polished, and you can see that in the score, user score. People who bought Parsecs like it a bit more than 60 seconds, and I see why, because it is a more polished game in a number of respects. We definitely had an impact there, but if you just like kind of objectively looked at it from the perspective of the user score, it's just like 3% more depending on the day. And was that worth all the investment that we put in? Good question. But if you compare the budgets of 60 seconds and 60 Parsecs, 60 seconds was more than 10 times cheaper than Parsecs to make. And if you compare the revenue in the first 6 months from the numbers that I've showed you, despite the fact that 60 seconds was cheaper, it made almost twice the amount of money that Parsecs made in the first 6 months. So the fact that you put more money in or more energy or more work in does not necessarily translate into a better effect in terms of revenue, sales, or even the quality effect for that matter. At the same time, you have to be wary of external factors, which is the market. You know, there's a big difference between 2015 and 2018 or 19. So, for all intents and purposes, the difference between dynamics might come from the fact that we're living in a different age in terms of games. And kind of coming back to scaling, the fact that you have more people might seem like, you have this original game, you give it out to a group of people, you think maybe it'll work in the same way that it worked for you in the old team dynamics, especially if you had a small team, but that's not always the case. Oftentimes, people don't understand what you intended in the first place. They have their own ideas. Sometimes they're better, but sometimes they're not. And sometimes if you're involved in the process, like we were, it just gets more messy because they're kind of pulling their way, we're kind of pulling our way, and we're trying to reach compromises. And definitely the one thing I learned is that you never compromise when you think your vision is right. If you go and start making compromises, things get worse. Never make compromises. Unless you're really, really forced to, but then you're in trouble. And that kind of takes me to the last point. Sequels are fun if you develop something that was cool. But there's a word for like intellectual property, if you say original property, like first game from a series, right? If you make the second game from the series, in some way, it's no longer original, right? It's a follow-up to something that already did well. And you might actually bring a lot of originality into the play with the sequels or prequels or whatever. But will they be as original as the first one? Will they have the same kind of fresh feel that captivated a lot of people? Because it was like, oh, right, yeah, I dig this idea. It's like, oh, a family in a nuclear fallout shelter. I can totally, somewhat relate to that. Can you relate to a space crew trapped in a spaceship somewhere in the void of kind of space with nothing left because the Earth just got blown to pieces? Maybe you can, or maybe you can't. Maybe you prefer the original one better, and also you've played it so many times that you're no longer interested in saving people eating tomato soup and nothing else. So kind of to wrap up, I wanted to do a very, very quick tour through some other sequels that got released over the last couple of years. And I took the liberty of doing a very weird calculation using a simple algorithm for estimating how many sales a game got based on the number of reviews it got on Steam. So for the purpose of this, I only take into account Steam sales and Steam reviews. And I examine a couple of games. So yeah, bear in mind, right? So don't quote me on these numbers. There's a number of games that got their sequels released. And actually, this is the time when, if you look closely, there's a lot of indie games from kind of 2015, 2017 that are releasing sequels. And some of them are successful, some are not. But if you compare the numbers, what strikes me, and is something I never predicted, like I never thought is the case, is that a lot of sequels that get released don't really sell as much as the successful original ones. Like in terms of Magica, where they had a problem with a lot of people hating the second one for whatever reason, you can see that the numbers are like 4 times smaller. SteamWorld Dig, a really cool game. It's like 3 times less the numbers. Take a look at Banner Saga, which was hugely popular, right? Everyone's heard. Like, who hasn't heard of Banner Saga? Hands up. Just the 3.5 people, right? Most of you heard about it. But yeah, it's a super popular game. It's like almost 2 million copies, and then it's like 4 times less. And don't get me wrong, 500,000 copies is still a very impressive result. But if you think about what we went through and how we kind of built upon the original game and invested more into getting the sequel done, you can only imagine how much more they might have invested in actually making the sequel get going. And in the end, it didn't work as well as the original one. Kingdom, this is actually a unique example because the sequels sold more. Kingdom is actually was made in Berlin, as far as I'm aware, in Saftladen, or at least the offer is based in Saftladen now, so it's a German game, really good one. And it's actually spawned 2 sequels, and I'm only quoting the first sequel. Here, again, 2 times less copies. Some of the numbers might be skewed just for the very reason that the sequel has been out, for instance, like less than a year, right? So you can actually see this is a very similar case to ours. Like the numbers are fairly close to what we had with Parsecs. The original game was actually released very close to when we released 60 Seconds. And the sales numbers are super close to what we have with 60 Seconds as well. I'm getting pulled off the stage, so I'll quickly click through these. But as you can see, like every single sequel that you go through has a very kind of similar dynamic. Either you can see there's potential, like here, for growth, because that's only been released in December, and that's a really good result. Very good game, by the way. Or you can see that there's definitely a cutoff, and the sequel is not necessarily doing as well as the original. And probably what's going to happen is it's going to end in the same area as the the first ones that I quoted, which were like 4 times less copies sold, 3 times less copies sold. And probably this is not going to catch up with the original. So just remember, sequels are not easy to make. They give you no guarantees of success or actually better quality. And if I were to recommend what you do if you have a successful game, you can always come back and make a sequel. But better use your creative potential and the resources you just got because your game is selling well to do something new and original. Perhaps expand on the previous game later if you have enough fresh ideas and you actually feel like you want to do it, rather than feeling forced because the game is perpetually successful and you have to capitalize on it in any way. And just remember that increasing your team size twice does not mean you'll make more games in half the time. That's it. Thank you very much.